All right, everybody. I'm happy to say welcome to our second big webinar. This is a 45-minute webinar where we're going to talk about another key issue, well, actually a whole set of issues in Aristotle that stem from types of friendship and relationships. I think some of you know me already. I'm the president of ReasonIO. I do a lot of work on Aristotle, and I use Aristotle quite a bit in my work with individual clients and organizations, and I'm also an advocate of virtue ethics. So Aristotle is somebody who's very close to my heart in many ways. Here's what we're going to do in the webinar itself. We're going to open with a few leading questions, and there's a lot of other questions we could be asking as well. And then we're going to talk about four main topics. One is the nature of friendship in the full sense. Aristotle talks quite a bit about this. And then we're going to talk about the main types of friendship that Aristotle distinguishes, which go beyond just the three types of friendship, but it also includes some other forms. And then we'll talk about a few of the common problems and issues that arise out of friendships that Aristotle tackles. And then we'll talk about some issues and problems in contemporary relationships that Aristotle, of course, couldn't have talked about since things like Facebook didn't exist in his time, and the workplace was quite a bit different in ancient Greece. But we'll see whether Aristotle's theory could help us make sense of those. I'll probably go on for about 25 minutes or so, and then we're going to have about 20 minutes or so for Q&A and discussion. If you've got your mic open, could you mute your mics, because I'll just be presenting during this time, and we don't want to get a lot of background noise or feedback. So here we go. If you think about important questions that are coming up, and let me just mute some of the people who are on. There we go. If you think about some of the important questions that tend to come up when we're thinking about friendship in general, what makes people real friends with one another? This is a question that arises on the playground when we're children and may continue through to the rest of our life. Another important question is, should we be loyal to our friends even if they do wrong or bad things? This is just as puzzling to ancient philosophers as it was in the present, when we see this coming up as a theme in a lot of sitcoms and dramas and other media productions. And then what should we do when friends or relationships make conflicting demands on us, when we have more than one friend and we're not quite sure how to reconcile all of the things that people are asking us to do. And then here's another question that Aristotle himself doesn't consider, but I think does come up for some of us. Is it all right to spend time with or be friendly with people who we don't really like? Is there anything good about being friendly, not in the sense of actually being friends with people, but just behaving in a friendly manner? And if we look at these questions, there's certain implications that arise out of this. One of them is that we're not always clear about what friendship, whatever we understand friendship to be, is or involves or requires of us and of other people. Another important thing that comes out of this is that friendship seems to have something like a moral value. This is an aspect of relationships and friendship that often gets left out of other ethical approaches besides virtue ethics. There is one other important family called the ethics of care that's been talked about recently that highlights that. But a lot of the modern virtue or modern moral theories tend to see friendship just in terms of other values, and we want to think about, is friendship something that really has to be central in moral theory? And then if so, what kind of demands does it impose on us? Should we consider being a good friend a duty, or is it something that we can do or not do depending on how we feel about it? Is it something optional? And another implication that comes out of asking these sorts of questions is that we could use some guidance in determining the nature and extent of friendship. And so if we ask ourselves where would we go for that guidance, there's a lot of different sources. There's whole sections on self-help in bookstores that we can go to, and some of them have to do with friendship. There's lots of blogs, there's lots of great podcasts. But I think that we would benefit by going back to classic philosophical texts. And Aristotle is one of the great people to think about it. Another thing, too, we want to begin from where we actually are, so thinking about friendship in the present. We use this term friend to cover an awful lot of ground, and I think this is part of why people sometimes get mixed up about the nature of friendship and what friendship would require. So consider, two extremes. One extreme is people we've just met or only interact with, say, on the bus or at the workplace, or maybe even only know through social media. We're going to talk a bit about that towards the end. But, it's one of the interesting features that Facebook, makes us friends, and then you can have friends suggested to you or making requests of you who you don't even know. They just happen to know somebody else that you know. At another extreme, we use friend for these very, very close, intense relationships. And another question that we want to think about is when we're saying that some people are friends, what are we contrasting them with? Do we contrast friends with, say, relatives when we say you can pick your friends but you can't pick your family? Or is it strangers? Or are friends the opposite of enemies? Can friends and lovers coincide at all? Does that actually work? There's a whole literature and I would say set of songs and movies that are devoted to exploring that common issue. Now, when we turn to what Aristotle has in mind, his treatment of friendship, in Greek philia, extends to a number of different relationships. And he focuses at the very beginning on what the full meaning of friendship would be as a paradigm for other friendships. So we can talk about friendship almost with a capital F as the ideal that we're judging other friendships in relation to. And he also makes an important distinction between different types of relationships in terms of the bases that they're founded on and that they exist in terms of. Some of this is probably a bit of review for some of you who are tuning into the webinar. Let's talk about the characteristics of friendship. And there's actually 8 of these if we look at Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, books 8 through 9, and especially if we supplement it with another book of his, which is called the Eudemian Ethics. So one key thing is friendship is inherently personal. It has to do with the relationship between people. It's not about, a relationship to a bottle of beer or a ton of salt or even, your iPhone. And we might get into questions about, well, what about animals? Our pets depends on whether we see them as persons. There may be something quasi-friendship from Aristotle's perspective about that. But it has to be between people. It also involves wishing good or wishing well for the other, wanting the other person to have something good. This is integral to the affection that is part of friendship. So this is a key idea. The wishing good has to be reciprocal and it has to be mutual, or you don't really have a friendship. In that case, you have one person who wishes the other person well, but the other person may not care about the person who's wishing them well at all. We wouldn't really call that a friendship, and Aristotle says that's not a friendship either. Another key issue, and this may almost go without saying, is that friends know they are friends. Why does Aristotle bring this up? Well, because he talks about something that I think we can probably relate to even better in our own celebrity-obsessed culture, which is that if the people don't actually know each other and don't know that they're in a relationship, they're not actually friends. So, for example, a stalker would not be in a friend relationship. They would have a high level of desire, and they may engage in a lot of, sending letters and, presents or something like that. But the other person who's being stalked is not friends with that person. Perhaps if they're a big enough celebrity, they have people who handle that for them. So, now some other important characteristics. Friendship is generally based on having something in common with each other. And there could be a number of different things in common. And we'll talk about a bit of that, hopefully in the questions, but also in some of the content a little bit later. Another thing that Aristotle says that we might find a bit challenging, especially in the age of the internet, is that friendship involves a shared life, living together, and spending time together. He's got that famous saying that don't call people friends unless they've eaten a bucket of salt together, meaning they've shared enough meals that there's plenty of passage of time. And meals are particularly good. If you think about when you get together and eat with somebody, you talk with them, you get to know them. There's a lot of things that tend to come up that don't happen necessarily in less unstructured sharing, right? Another thing that he says is that friendship involves what he calls deliberate choice. And the word for this in Greek is proairesis. It means the things that we commit ourselves to. The things that form our character. Friendship in the full sense involves who we are as people. The last thing that comes up, and this doesn't happen in Book 8, so I think a lot of people miss this. It comes up in Book 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics, is that friends share joys and sorrows with each other. They, in a way, they support each other through the sorrows, but it's also important to share in each other's joys. So these are all important elements of friendship. And there's what we might see as a paradox at first here. These features of friendship, Aristotle says, are characteristic of friendship in the fullest sense of the term, the best kind of friendship. Now, those kinds of friendships are rare, and sometimes a given person may not have a friendship like that with anybody. They may not even know that that's a possibility for themselves, but it's still a criterion. So the question then that we would have to ask is, how do most people know what these sorts of friendship are like and use it as a model? And we might think about the way that culture works, or stories that are told, or seeing other people who do seem to enjoy that sort of thing. Perhaps we might think of it as something that's built into human nature. Our instinct for sociability, when it's most fully developed, would involve something along these lines. So let's move on to the second topic. Now that we've talked about this fullest sense of friendship, we can start distinguishing between types of friendship. And Aristotle begins by talking about three kinds of good that he generally will disentangle from each other in his ethics. And he says friendships can be based on these different kinds of good. So we have, at the highest level, virtue or the noble good, in Greek, to kalon. We have pleasure, the whole range of things that make us feel good, but not necessarily in the sense that doing good gives us satisfaction. But when you enjoy your coffee, or you listen to some music that you like, or you play on a sports team, and whether you win or lose, you enjoy playing with those people. And then at a lower level, we have friendships of what he calls utility or usefulness, to sympheron in Greek. And he does consider those to be a sort of friendship, whereas we might in our time say, if we're being very strict about it, that's not really a friendship at all. I think that when we look at the range of relationships that we have, though, we see that we do have some of those. Then he discusses what we call unequal friendships, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And he also distinguishes family relationships apart from each other, in part because family relationships are, to a large extent, unavoidable. So that saying about you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your relatives, Aristotle would be entirely attuned to that. So let's talk about the three types that he distinguished at the first. I mentioned that there's three different modalities or kinds of goods and bad things that he distinguishes. And so these provide us with bases for the relationships that we have with each other. There is the noble or the fine, to kalon in Greek, also could be translated as the beautiful, and the base. So when we're friends with somebody because we really, see something good in them, that would probably be this highest form of friendship. And then there's the pleasurable. Its opposite is the painful. Some people we are friends with just because we enjoy their company, or we like doing things with them, or they give us something that makes us feel good. And then there's the useful. These are people who are not necessarily pleasant, and they're not particularly good people, but they're useful to us in some way. Think about people who invite you to a party, or if we think about the online environment, they always seem to know about what event is happening, so it's good to be in contact with them, right? Now, these three different friendships provide us with bases, or three different goods provide us with different bases for friendships. So let's talk about the first one, friendships of the good or virtue. Aristotle thinks this is pretty rare. And why is it rare? Well, there's two really good reasons. One is that in order to get to know a person, you need time. And you have to spend time with them that you're probably taking away from other people. So you can't get to know hundreds of people intimately the way that you do a really close friend. I know that there's that saying these days about something like 120 or 130 people are your tribe or stuff like that. But those aren't people that you can all know with the same level of intimacy. So there's that aspect of time. And then, of course, there's the requirement that if you want to enjoy somebody else's company because they're a genuinely good person, they have to be a genuinely good person. They have to develop what Aristotle would call some measure of virtue. Virtue is a set of habits that we have made part of the fabric of who we are. The fabric of character, to use Nancy Sherman's really nice phrase for that. This is not something that's available for people who haven't had some level of moral development. Now, these friends feel goodwill towards each other precisely because of who each other are. They're not friends with each other based on what they're getting out of the relationship. They recognize the goodness of the other person. That's what attracts them. And this kind of friendship is the most durable over time. These people really like each other for being good people, so they may have occasional lapses, but for the most part, they're going to approve of each other's decisions, commitments, the changes that they go through. They will probably be there for each other, and these will always or at least typically involves some degree of usefulness and pleasure as well. If you're a good person, you like being with other good people. Good people are useful to each other, but it's not just based on that usefulness or pleasure. If it is, then we're talking about something like this, a friendship of pleasure. And Aristotle thinks that pleasure really is a good. Here's where Aristotle would differ from some other moral theorists, like the Stoics, for example, or later on Immanuel Kant. He thinks pleasure is a good. It's not the good, but it's a good. And there's, if we think about it, what Aristotle says makes a lot of sense. There's two ways that we tend to get pleasure out of relationships that are based on pleasure. We could be deriving pleasure from each other. If you think about, lovers who derive sexual pleasure from their relationship. And, there should be a lot of other things going on, hopefully, as well in the relationship, and so it's not just a hookup. But in that case, one person is giving pleasure to another, the other person is giving pleasure to that other person. Or it could be that it's not so much the other person they find pleasant, but they do something that they both enjoy. Like, when we talk about hanging out, right? Hanging out might be bicycling together. It might be having a meal together. There's something shared. And there could be an aspect, that mixes both of them. You go to a restaurant, you like the fact that your friend can talk intelligently about the food that you're eating, or the drink that you're enjoying. But you're really there to enjoy the food and the drink. And a few other things with friendships of pleasure. These friends are friends with each other not for their own sakes, but for the sake of the pleasure they enjoy. So these friendships are not going to be as lasting as the friendship in terms of virtue or the good. Because when pleasure is no longer experienced, then the friendship often breaks down. People say, I'm not getting the same thing out of it. Oftentimes we have that, it's not you, it's me. But the me is, you're not giving me what I want, right? And Aristotle thinks that younger people, often driven by their desires that they haven't quite figured out how to manage, often fall into these sorts of friendships of pleasure. And there's nothing wrong with that, Aristotle thinks. Then we have friendships of usefulness. And usefulness is also a modality of the good. It's goods that are instrumental for or productive or sometimes preservative of other goods. If you think about the ultimate useful good, it's money. You can use money to buy things, but you can't use it for much else. I mean, you could, of course, decorate things with it, or I suppose, as a napkin, but it's primarily useful just for buying things. And friendships do form on the basis of the friends having or providing some usefulness for each other. I use the example of somebody who happens to throw really good parties, but you don't really enjoy that person for his or her own sake, or find them particularly pleasant, but you do like going to the parties. There's a lot of friendships like that. These friendships are the least durable, and they often break off when the usefulness ends. There can be a lot of disagreements about who's being more useful to the other person, and so that can be a problem as well. And then we have what we call unequal friendships, where there's some sort of imbalance there. Some friendships involve the friends getting something different out of the relationship with each other. So I give you three examples of the main possibilities here. Could be that one friend has virtue to offer, but the other friend isn't virtuous, but they can offer pleasure to the other friend. And a relationship can exist on that basis. Likewise, virtuous people may have lots of friends who only have usefulness to offer, and that's okay too. Some people, it's a matter of pleasure and usefulness. When we see people involved in romantic relationships where one person seems to be out of the league of the other person, and we say, oh, I wonder what's going on there, it may be that sort of relationship. We also have family relationships, and I'm not going to talk much about that here. I will talk about that more in the longer seminars. But Aristotle distinguishes between the relationship between spouse and spouse, child and parent, sibling and sibling. Each of those have possibilities for being certain kinds of friends with each other. Then there's extended family, which could be quite large in ancient Greece. And then we have neighbors and fellow citizens and residents. And there's some sort of relationship like friendship going on with these people. So let's talk now about some of the problems and issues that come up with friendship. And I'm going to jump right into these rather than summarizing them right here in order to stay on time. So one of the interesting questions that I think still is asked about today, we usually frame it to opposites attract, right? But the Greeks saw it as, is friendship based on similarities or differences? And Aristotle says, well, sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other. Friendships of virtue and pleasure involve the members being similar to each other. They offer something similar to each other. They recognize something similar in each other. Friendships of usefulness tend to be based on differences. They provide each other with what they need, and what they need is what they lack. That's why they're useful to each other. Unequal friendships, of course, also involve difference as well. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And that leads it into the next question. Well, if things aren't exactly the same, how do we equalize them? How do we balance things out? And so the question that we're asking is, what can people provide each other to balance out the difference in what they offer to each other? Aristotle considers two possible goods, and we might think of a lot of other things as well. So he says the friend who is not offering as much can show greater affection towards the other person. and that would be entirely appropriate in Aristotle's view. That's actually a way to make up for the lack on the other person's part. Another possibility, honor or respect shown towards the other person. And this might take a lot of different forms, but that's quite an interesting idea. Another key issue, when should friendships be broken off? This is a classic problem that continues on through the present. If you read advice columns, you're going to see this coming up forever. With all sorts of different modalities and permutations. In the case of virtue, friendship based on virtue, if one partner clearly becomes no longer good, if they change their character radically, well, that friendship can't last on that basis. It could fall down into a lower level, of course. In the case of pleasure, Aristotle says when the relationship no longer offers pleasure to the different people, it's perfectly fine to break it off, because that's what the relationship is about. In the case of usefulness, when the relationship is no longer consistently useful, it's not only common, but also in Aristotle's view, acceptable for that type of friendship to be broken off. And this is a really important point to make, because I think a lot of times people remain in relationships that they're not getting much out of a sense of obligation or guilt. If we consider contemporary relationships, we might ask about questions like these. Where do romantic relationships fit? Or what about work colleagues? So let's explore those. Aristotle does discuss relationships between lovers, and he also does discuss relationships in marriage between spouses. He notes that relationships between lovers are primarily about pleasure or usefulness. And you could have it's very often to find that one person is in it to get pleasure, the other person to get something useful, because they don't find the other person that pleasant. And lovers often end up disputing what's going on in the relationship. Each person thinks that they're giving more and getting less than they deserve, and so there's a lot of interesting problems that arise. Another question that we want to think about is, what do we expect a romantic relationship to provide? What sort of friendship? Do we expect that every romantic relationship be one of a soulmate with somebody who is our equal in virtue, or do we say sometimes it's okay just to have fun? Work colleagues is another interesting thing to consider. Should we consider people from work to be friends? And I'm going to skip through this. We can certainly explore this in the Q&A, which I want to get to very quickly. But we should think about what kind of good we provide them, or what kind of good they provide us. Online relationships, huge issue, right? I think about what we're doing right now. We are engaged in something like a community of inquiry through freeconferencecall.com. What's actually going on with that? Facebook is probably the most overt in framing things in terms of friendship, many of whom may be with people we don't actually know. We could think about what other kinds of relationships we have online, and what sort of relationships we should have, and what would that require from us. And then we want to think about when we shift from one kind of relationship to another. Relationships are not always static. There's two extremes. Some people think that all of your friendships should be unconditional, deep. You're not getting anything out of the other person, and that's an extreme. That's almost unrealizable. Another extreme would be viewing all relationships in terms merely out of usefulness. What can you get out of the other person? And we should think about how do we transition one kind of relationship to another when the relationship goes through changes, or when the people change? And what do we do if people demand that we do that? What if we're having a relationship of pleasure and we like it the way it is, and the other person says, I really want to know you for the person you are, and we need to get much more intimate? That's a good question. So I've gone a little bit over, but we've got plenty of time for Q&A. We'll spend about 20 minutes doing that. There should be quite a few questions, I think, in the chat already. So, Andy, if you want to read them, and I'll answer each question in turn.
Yeah, our chat has been primarily technical stuff, mostly sound issues. So I think what we'll probably do is, I know that there was some background noise, and so we did actually try to mute everyone rather effectively. Greg, if you could, since you're hosting, if you could unmute everyone, and then we'll just let folks ask questions audibly. If anyone is in listen-only mode or you're not in a location where you can easily speak your question, feel free to post it to the chat, and I will happily be your voice to verbalize that question to Greg in the chat. But let's start with muting or unmuting everyone and see how that works for us for the start. Okay,
and if you're not going to ask questions, go ahead and re-mute yourself once I unmute you, if you would. And Martin, you can certainly use the chat if you like. I'm perfectly happy to do that. All right, so who's got a question about friendship, Aristotle, relationships? We could almost do this sort of like an advice column, you know? Dear Aristotle, I've got a friend who's got this problem.
Right, exactly.
I have a question.
Okay.
Hi, Dr. Sadler. My question is, can you use Aristotle's concept of friendship to sort of build up an idea of a public sphere, how a public sphere should operate?
Oh. Yeah, so that's a tricky one. You're talking, when you say the public sphere, we're talking about sort of the political arena, right? How we exist as fellow members of a political community, but we're also talking about what we might call civil society, not a concept that Aristotle had, but this whole range of forums and institutions that we're part of that aren't part of the state as such, but we do public things within, and I think social media would fit into that as well. Can Aristotle's theory be extended to that? Yes and no. And Aristotle himself makes some attempts to try to extend not the three types of friendship, but the notion of friendship into the political sphere. So that, for example, if we can get citizens to exist in a friendly way towards each other, then we don't have to worry so much about law courts and justice. We can get them to treat each other well and to desire the good for each other. And he said there is also an interesting relationship between the political sphere and the family for Aristotle. He suggests that family relationships should be modeled on certain kinds of rule or regimes, right? So the relationship between parents and children should be a monarchy. And monarchy means where the ruler is ruling for the good of all the people involved, not just dominating them through power. It shouldn't be a tyranny, right? He suggests that the relationship between spouse and spouse should be an aristocratic one, where each does what is best in their own sphere. He's got some pretty fixed notions about gender relations when it comes to that, but I think we could abandon that and say something a bit more flexible. Now, another thing that the Greeks also pointed out, this goes back all the way to Plato, is that friendships within the public sphere could be, in some respects, destabilizing, right? Because you think about the notion of giving preference to those who you are connected with in one way or another. We call that today nepotism or corruption. And in some cases, it's really, it's bad for the society. In some cases, it actually turns out to be quite good, because sometimes it means, like if you've got really virtuous people, they're all putting each other into play. But it can lead to a lot of jealousy and faction. Friendship is also something, as Plato pointed out, or at least put in somebody else's mouth, since Plato never actually speaks for himself, that can lead to undoing unjust regimes. Friends are willing to brave dangers that other people might not necessarily put up with. So that's kind of a long answer. Yeah.
We've got several other questions that are popping up in the chat, so I'm just going to start to go through those.
Sounds good.
Okay, so Duncan says, sort of a two-part here. It said, it makes me think of the line in Idiocracy when he says, it's really cool that you like money too, maybe we could hang out. And then he goes on to say, what would Aristotle think of relationships based on money? And then we've got about 4 other questions on deck, just so you know.
Okay. Well, so those would be relationships of usefulness. You know, when we're getting money or other, you know, you might say goods that we can transport from place to place from a person, and we're not hanging out with the person just because we actually like their company or we admire them, you know, because of who they are. Then it's a relationship of usefulness, and Aristotle thinks that has its place. As a matter of fact, we probably should have quite a few useful friends, and then, you know, a smaller circle of pleasant friends and a very small circle of friends in terms of virtue. So, you know, somebody like that would be in the outer circle, I suppose. Aristotle thinks, too, that if you think that money is the highest good, you've got priorities radically backwards, because money is only good for other things. So I think that probably answers that. What's the next one?
Okay, so I think we'll go, Christopher Edwards has a two-parter here. So he says, first, I like how moral development of self and friendships of virtue are tied together. And then he goes on to say, does Aristotle say anything about loneliness or combating loneliness through moral development?
So, yeah, the first part, you know, the really difficult transition is, you know, what if you're not virtuous, but you do recognize the goodness of virtue, right? How do you transmute a friendship that at first might be based on pleasure into a friendship that's really about virtue? Because it doesn't do you any good to pretend that it's based on virtue if you're not already, you know, virtuous and doing well. This is what happens in a lot of romantic relationships too, I think, by the way. So that's an interesting question and issue that Aristotle doesn't provide us with a lot of guidance with. But I think we could unpack some of the things that he's saying in terms of moral development. Now, the loneliness issue. So Aristotle thinks that the good life is not just a life of possessing and acting in accordance with virtue, but it is one that involves friendship, that is shared. So the question then is, well, what do you do if you're doing that and nobody else seems to care? What if everyone else is just motivated by money or ephemeral pleasures or a celebrity culture? You know, it's very tough then, and Aristotle doesn't deny that. I think nowadays we have more resources than, you know, people several generations ago did, in that we do have online community, which is not quite the same thing as being with somebody, you know, being in the same place and interacting with them. But it really does fill in some of the gaps, doesn't it? I mean, think about, again, what we're doing here. This would be impossible 20 years ago, and now this is something that we just, you know, do once a month.
Right.
And it's not really a big deal. And so I don't know that goes all the way to dealing with sort of being on your own in terms of virtue and developing towards virtue, but it certainly fills in some of the gaps.
So Martin has 2 questions.
Okay.
The first is, how should the relationship be between oneself and one's superiors? And the second question is, how could we adapt Aristotle's friendship model to today's social networked world? And we've got, I think, 2 more questions on deck, so okay. I'll let you answer either of those or both of them, however. All
right. Well, I'll try to be short with those. So the first one is a very interesting one, because a lot of you know, in the last like 15, 20 years, a lot of companies have gotten very savvy about trying to, you know, use this metaphor of we're all, you know, friends together, we're basically equals, I just happen to be your boss, you know. And they do this also with consumers, right? It's when you actually have a problem that you realize that it's not like that at all, or you don't want to do what they want to do. And I think that it's important to see those as relationships of merely utility, and perhaps not even friendships at all. Perhaps, you know, a superior subordinate relationship doesn't involve friendship and shouldn't be understood as involving friendship. Now, it could be different if, like, your leader is actually this virtuous person who you love working with, you look up to, that's a bit different. But those aren't that common, I found. So, then the second question was about social media and networks and things along those lines.
And one quick thing, Greg, before you answer that, Mark Smith had a follow-up that we might just sort of combine into that question.
Oh, okay.
And his was saying, do you think that friendships that develop online in anonymity, such as in MMOs or forums, can develop into full virtuous friendships if experienced as such by those involved, or does the anonymity serve as a barrier given that participants are never quite honest? So we've got sort of a social network relationship, and then the kind of cloak of anonymity that provides here. So
that is a really interesting wrinkle added to it. I was going to say that I think that all three of the kinds of friendships that Aristotle talks about can develop in, let's call it, mediated settings, right? Where Aristotle thinks that you have to be in the same place and the same time as the other person, and spend a good bit of duration with them in that way. And I think that a lot of that can now be done through intermediaries, through online, through talking on the phone, Skyping, writing things. Facebook, Twitter, they don't lend themselves quite so well to that. But I suppose you can write each other private messages, and you also can at least see some of the character of the person and how they behave. You can get to know quite a bit through online sleuthing about who a person is. Now, the anonymity thing, that's a interesting wrinkle. It's not necessarily that they're totally inaccessible to you if you don't know their name, or if they have a pseudonym or something like that. And I think that we have to look at the friendship of virtue as kind of approximative rather than as a finished state. So perhaps it may not be able to go quite as far in that direction with anonymity in place. But you can still get to know a lot about the person. You don't know what their name is, but you know that they went through this issue and understand matters in this way and respond to other issues in this way.
Great. So I think we'll give everyone who's chatting or thinking of a question just another moment to answer. But Greg, just before we run out of time, would you just give a very brief overview of what anyone who's considering the Saturday session might get? Yeah.
Sure. Actually, let me jump into, here we go, the next bit of stuff. So we have these 2-hour online seminars. I don't have the date on there. Coming up this Saturday at 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. So what we're going to do is we'll go over some of the same material, but we'll go over it in quite a bit more depth, and we'll look a lot more at some of the problems and solutions that Aristotle brings up, including some that we skipped over, like, for example, should you love yourself, or is that being selfish? Aristotle has a really interesting distinction between two different kinds of self-love, and he says that friendship for another person is, in some respect, based on loving yourself. So, how does that work? So we'll do that, and I'll provide some additional resources. We'll have that one will be more structured, so we'll have plenty of time for going over material, then question and answer, then going over some more material, then question and answer. I also would like to mention that I have some online courses developed on Nicomachean Ethics, books 1 through 5 and 6 through 10. We split it into 2 different courses, in part because otherwise it would just be a little bit overwhelming because there's so much material there. And if you haven't looked at the Aristotle playlist, sometimes if you're wondering about some topic, it may already be discussed, for 20 minutes in one of the videos on the main YouTube channel. So, but let's take a little bit more time. We can go over, a little bit of extra time, I think, since I went a little over time myself.
Well, thank you Thank you, Greg, and thank you to everyone who's saying such nice things in the chat window. That's always nice to see, and we're glad that this has value. Johanna has a question, and it says, an issue that has arisen is not knowing how deep or honest an online person might be comfortable with. The question might be ways to feel okay about a friendship, which turns out perhaps not to be as virtuous as one had initially thought.
Yeah.
That's a
very
great follow-up.
common experience, isn't it? You know, we have that going on since childhood all the way into adulthood. And it comes from a couple different quarters. Sometimes it's that the other person did willingly deceive us. And sometimes it's that we read the wrong things in, and they have plausible deniability, at least on their side, right? Because, you know, so this really gets at something fundamental. Aristotle thinks, and I think he's not unique in this, there's many other people who think this, that deep down inside, we all have a desire for the good. And part of our good as human beings is to have at least some relationships where we have this sharing that the deepest or highest kind of friendship offers to us. And so that primes us to be able to respond in that way and to develop relationships like that, but it can also easily lead us astray. And some people exist out there just to, you know, exploit that sort of thing. And I also mentioned there's you know, certain, let's call them advertising techniques or organizational behavior techniques that also play off of that as well. So Aristotle would say, I think, because he does talk about this to some degree, when something like that happens, we want to step back and think, all right, where did I end up being mistaken? Was the other person deceiving me? Did I allow my desires to induce me to read too much into things? And there's not much that we can do about it in the present, other than perhaps recognizing, if we want to continue the relationship, that it's not a relationship of virtue, but really just at best a relationship of pleasure or a relationship of usefulness. But we can think about, you know, for the future, how would we do things differently? What do we need to be attuned to? And we might also reflect on you know, our own moral condition. Are we as far along the way to virtue as we would like? You know, sometimes we bring other people, and again, Aristotle doesn't discuss this, but I think this makes sense in terms of Aristotle's thing. Sometimes we bring other people into our lives and become very closely attached to them because they have qualities, or at least seem to have qualities, that we ourselves feel are lacking in ourselves. And so, you know, that's probably not the smartest thing to do on our part, is it? So, yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah. There's nothing else in the chat right now, Greg. So.
All right. Well, let me then bring it to a close. We already talked about the other resources that we have. You can always email Andy for any additional information about the webinars or seminars, and we will be sending out to you I'll be, you know, taking the recording from this, turning it into a YouTube video. We'll send you the link to that. It'll have the slides in it, and we can send you the handout that I placed in the additional resources along with that you might find kind of useful. So, oops, there we go. Get that back up. So, some really excellent questions. Some of those I will be covering in the online seminars. You can also find discussion of them in quite a few of the videos, because I've gone through the entire Nicomachean ethics. But these are perennial topics. Aristotle is not going to go out of vogue on this matter, because the issues that he's grappling with are questions that we're always going to have to deal with, and our great-great-great-great-grandchildren are going to be dealing with some of the same problems, perhaps in a very different, you know, media environment, but these aren't going to go away. So, really great questions. I really enjoyed this, and I hope to see all of you in some of the other webinars or in some of our other online events.
Yeah, we'll see some of you Saturday. Thank you so much. And if there's any questions, like Greg said, just shoot me an email, and I'll be sure to get it to him. So, thanks, Greg. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.